Sasaki Kojiro is one of those characters that you come across that just straight up intrigues you. Like, everything about him and what he does just captures my attention through and through. And Takehiko Inoue is literally known for creating just simply wonderful characters. As the author of like 3 award-winning mangas across 3 different demographics here, he's more than cemented his talents and passion for writing incredible characters. But why? Why is Sasaki Kojiro seemingly just atop that pile of his characters? Let's find out.
Sometimes you gotta close the door to open a window.
I titled this video Vagabond's Sound of Silence primarily because I wanted to talk about Sasaki Kojiro, and I feel like the Sound of Silence is the perfect analogy or anagram to use to describe this man. Quite frankly, incredibly underrated character in the series in my opinion, and whenever there is discussions about Vagabond, it's often centered around Musashi and very, very rarely Kojiro, and it always makes me scratch my head because, I mean, Musashi is cool and all that, but a character like Kojiro, who is literally deaf, mute, in a world where words and hearing them means the difference sometimes between life and death, and how he sits atop a pile of all these fighters as quote-unquote the strongest within his world, it's insane to me. And to give you some backstory on Kojiro, we need to go back to chapter 128, 17 years before the start of Musashi's journey at the Battle of Sekigahara. A letter is sent from the majestic Hitanosho Castle, a castle on the verge of falling into enemy hands. A letter from the same father of Sasaki Kojiro, a former disciple of Kanamake Jisai, the same Kanamaki who seeks a solemn end to his life after following the way of the sword. The father of Sasaki knew his castle was going to fall and opted to place his son in an escape boat and send him across the seas in hopes he'd reach Kanamaki Jisai, who'd raise him and take care of him. Hang on a minute, this is the fucking story of Superman? This is the plot of Superman? A child sent from a distant place from a desperate parent praying for his survival, only for that kid to grow up and be ridiculously strong, or while also being extremely different to everyone else around. This is the fucking plot of Superman. I fucking knew it. I knew. I just knew. I knew Sasaki Kojiro was Superman. I just knew. I always knew. God fucking Takehiko Inoue, you're a fucking genius. I knew there was a reason I loved this character so much. Good lord. Anyway, back on track. I'm getting sidetracked here. Anyway, Kojiro wasn't always deaf. It was actually his arrival on the beach where Kanamaki decided he was going to die that stole his ability to hear. As his boat crashed under the waves, he lost his hearing. But what he lost in his hearing, he also gained in a natural affinity for the sword. You see, he arrived carrying a long sword here, a blade that Sasaki in real life, it made him famous, a longer sword than as the drying pole, which is later name dropped in Sasaki's first like proper fight against someone in the series. However, what I find the most interesting about the decision to make him deaf and mute within the story of Vagabond, which by the way, there is no sort of text to indicate that this was a real life scenario. There's no actual proof to indicate that Kojiro was deaf and mute in real life. But what I find the most interesting is how Takehiko presented this character, how he drew him, his facial expressions, and somehow how Takehiko was able to convey almost every single thought and emotion so perfectly through Sasaki's face and eyes. And this may come as a surprise to you, but I am not deaf, nor am I mute. I don't know anyone who is from birth deaf or mute, except for my mum, who lost a good chunk of her hearing ability just before she passed away, and I saw how challenging that was for her to deal with. So I can only imagine how difficult the world must be without hearing from birth, and as a result not being able to communicate the way everyone else was. I made this comparison earlier, but Kojiro's character reminded me of Superman, not only in the setup of his origins, but also in his existence within the world. An overwhelmingly strong force who's just treated differently. Like, Kojiro is shunned by kids from his village. We see this happening in his like past flashback arc, or how he's growing up here. He's shunned because he can't hear them and he can't communicate. He's called a freak and he's bullied for it in the same way Superman is shunned because ultimately he isn't human and he has abilities way beyond the scope of our humans' brains, basically, when beyond our capabilities. However, the big difference between Kojiro and Superman is that, as I mentioned before, ultimately, no matter how compassionate Kal-El may be, he just isn't human. It doesn't really matter how human he presents himself as, he just isn't human, but Kojiro is. And I think that's what makes him so likable and what makes you want to root for him so much, or at least for me anyway. Seeing a character not only have his speech taken away, but also his hearing taken away in a land and a time where samurai and ronin are constantly cutting each other down in an effort to be the strongest or invincible under the sun. And I think that's what makes me root for him even more. And as I mentioned earlier, despite Kojiro being deaf and mute, Takehiko was somehow able to perfectly convey Kojiro's every thought and emotion through his facial expressions, and more so his eyes. Kojiro's eyes are something that is pointed out many times throughout the series, and noted for being kind and innocent and warm and inviting. So even though Kojiro only says oh, you know, throughout the series, you still somehow just we always know what's going on in his brain, on his face, or in his heart. We always know what he's feeling, whether it's curiosity, excitement, fear, joy. And just throughout Kojiro's journey, there are incredible parallels drawn between himself and Musashi, which ultimately seems like a paradox in and of itself, because how does a man like Musashi, who's constantly deep in thought and able to hear and speak and comes from a deaf, mute, and throughout the series almost has zero internal thoughts or monologue, except for a handful of moments? Well, the answer that I've arrived at, and my interpretation of it, is that these two are two sides to the same coin. Their stories parallel each other alongside their character development, but at different points in time, where the stories somehow intersect every now and then, and you get to see those parallels come to fruition. For example, Musashi seeks out strong opponents to defeat, but Kojiro is often the one being sought out. When we first find Musashi, he is seeking battle, but somehow when we find Kojiro at the Battle of Sekigahara, he is the one being sought out by these hunters for survival against hordes of men seeking to cut him down. Musashi, several years after that very same battle where they both first met each other, had to fight for his life against the 70 yoshioka. And it's at this point where they truly start to parallel each other, because Musashi, when fighting, is constantly thinking, and it's shown against Denshichiro here at their long-awaited duel. Again, by the way, another opponent that they have in common, furthermore, in the parallels here, but a good chunk of this fight against Denshichiro is Musashi thinking and planning and plotting different ways to kill and defeat Denshichiro, and his mind becomes busy with all of these possibilities. However, as I mentioned before, Kojiro is really shown having these thoughts, having not so much doubts, but just having this cloudiness in his mind. There is no thinking for him, it's just only acting. This parallel is put on full display just before Musashi goes to fight all of the 70 yoshioka here. He has a chance encounter with Kojiro in chapter 208. It's also just before Denshichiro's fight, I believe. He sees Kojiro in silence cutting up Musashi's snowman with a stick that Musashi perceives as an actual wooden sword because of how fluid and how hard Kojiro is able to hit this. Kojiro emulates the dream that Musashi had of his childhood self, where Musashi had dreamt of his younger self teaching himself how to use the sword within the mountains. As Musashi often tells us, he had no teachers. The mountains taught him everything he needed to know. In the same way, a couple of years back, the mountains taught Kojiro everything that he needed to know. Musashi recognizes that he and Kojiro are sort of birds of a feather here, but what Kojiro has, a sense of self or in tune with his body and the movements taught to him by the sea and the mountains through years of not being able to hear or perceive people's words, and as a result, sort of not having his own internal monologue. He had no thoughts, and his ability to just carve a snowman with a flimsy stick that he was hitting as if it was a wooden sword itself. Musashi recognizes that in the pursuit of the sword, his mind became so busy of how to get better and how to evolve that he lost what originally made him so strong. I mean, he was strong, don't get me wrong, but he lost something. And he decides to make like Kojiro right here and clear his mind of thoughts and allow the sword to teach him once more. And through the sound of silence, Kojiro inadvertently teaches Musashi a skill he'd previously forgotten. Anyways, that is everything from me. I've been wanting to talk about Vagabond as I've been rereading it now for a hot minute. As you can tell, the books are piled up for research purposes right next to me here. I've officially run out of physical copies and physical volumes to read. I'm missing 3, so I've now got to read it on digital scans, which is kind of pain, I'm not gonna lie. But the second reread has been hitting incredibly hard for me, and it genuinely just cements the series as my top 1 series of all time. And I've got a bunch more videos that I would love to make on this series, so please let me know what you thought of this video in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and as always, I'll catch you guys all in the next one. Much fucking love. Big fucking kisses. Peace.